Good morning, Scotland. Good morning, social media land. I hope you are well. It is Monday, the 14th of October, 2024. This week, we're going to take a look at Scotland's finances, our present economy, and the exploitation of our economy by Westminster, and the golden future that awaits us with independence. We shall start this week by discussing what revenue streams does Scotland have and who actually collects them. The question sits at the heart of debates surrounding Scottish independence. Despite generating a range of revenue streams, much of Scotland's revenue is still collected and controlled by the UK Treasury. The revenue from income tax, corporation tax, VAT, national insurance, oil and gas production flows directly to Westminster. Scotland controls only a fraction of this revenue, including devolved powers over land and buildings transaction tax and a small portion of income tax. So it's very clear that financial power remains largely in Westminster's hands, which in turn reinforces the perception that Scotland lacks meaningful fiscal autonomy. One of the key mechanisms that highlight this control is the Barnett Formula. Created in 1978, it determines the block grant Scotland receives each year from Westminster. The formula adjusts the funds Scotland receives based on changes in English public spending in areas like health, education and housing. If England increases its spending in these areas, Scotland's block grant also increases. If England cuts its spending, Scotland's budget is reduced proportionately based on Scotland's population and the share relative to England's, which is about 9.5%. While the formula provides stability, it fails to account for relative need, a major flaw that has drawn widespread criticism. Countries like Wales, with higher poverty levels and greater health challenges, receive less funding per capita than Scotland, even though their needs are greater. Critics argue that the Barnett Formula should be replaced with a needs-based approach, one that would direct more resources to areas facing higher social and economic challenges. Even with some devolved tax powers, Scotland's financial control remains tied to Westminster's decisions. For instance, Scotland now controls a portion of income tax, but the block grant is reduced by the amount Westminster would have collected from Scottish taxpayers, requiring Scotland to raise its own tax revenues to fill the gap. This then is expressed in the media as Scotland being the highest taxed country in the Union. This partial control over income tax gives Scotland some flexibility, but the fact that the overall financial framework remains in Westminster's hands underscores how little control Scotland actually has. The Barnett Formula is also highly flexible in Westminster's favour. In 2017, the UK government negotiated a £1 billion funding package for Northern Ireland without applying the Barnett Formula to Scotland or Wales, bypassing the system altogether. This ability to sidestep the formula highlights how Westminster can manipulate financial allocations based on political convenience rather than fairness. The effects of the Barnett Formula becomes even more apparent when English public spending is cut. If there's a £1 billion reduction in English spending, say, on healthcare, Scotland's block grant would also face a reduction, approximately £100 million. This reduction hits Scotland's public services despite the fact that Scotland has had no control over the decision to cut spending in England. So when the Scottish Government makes cuts, it's because the pot of money generously given to us by Westminster has been reduced. Reduced because they have reduced their own spending. Factor in that Scotland has no borrowing powers, and it also has to submit a balanced budget by law every year to Westminster, and you can see even more that we have less control over our own fiscal policies and finances. Moreover, while devolved spending is adjusted through this formula, areas like defence and foreign policy, which are reserved matters controlled by Westminster, don't directly affect our block grant. This means Scotland's budget is still vulnerable to cuts in areas that it can't control. The Barnett Formula fails to account for Scotland's unique financial situation, reinforcing a system where control remains largely in the hands of Westminster. Despite generating significant revenue, Scotland remains fiscally dependent on decisions made outside of her borders. So what would happen if Scotland controlled all of its own revenues? Without the constraints of the Barnett Formula and with full control over its resources, Scotland could allocate funds based on its own priorities. It could manage its oil and its gas revenues, set its own policies for income tax and reinvest in areas like renewable energy, which currently produces over 25% of Europe's offshore wind power. By controlling its financial future, Scotland could break free from a system that restricts its financial autonomy and reinvest in the country's long-term prosperity. This lack of control begs a critical question. Why should Scotland remain bound to a financial framework designed to benefit Westminster? The answer for many is clear, and the answer is independence. It offers Scotland the opportunity to fully manage its own economic future, free from the constraints of the Barnett Formula and the dominance of Westminster's fiscal control. Tomorrow, we shall be discussing what Westminster would lose if Scotland became an independent nation. I truly hope you can join us. In the meantime, have an amazing day.